My name is Frank Schaefer, and I grew up in Switzerland as the son of evangelical missionaries, just a stone's throw from the ski resort of Crans-Montana that just saw 40 young people killed in a club on New Year's Eve and over 100 seriously burnt, distributed all over Switzerland and indeed into other European country burn centers for treatment. Looking at the faces of the young people who died, I felt so sad. They reminded me of my teenage grandchildren, beautiful, young, hopeful faces. And I read the Swiss newspapers because I grew up there and I speak French. And one of the reports coming out of those papers and from other sources as well is that one of the reasons a lot more young people died and were burnt severely than they would have been is because when the fire started and then accelerated very quickly, instead of running out to safety, many of these young people did what so many do at concerts and at other places. They turned around, whipped out their cell phones, and started shooting pictures and making movies to, I guess, later post online of what was going on. Maybe they thought something cool or interesting was happening that they'd want to share on their social media connections. And a couple days after the fire, I read an article this morning by David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, who I find very thoughtful. And indeed, I quote him in my new book, The Gospel of Zip, toward the end of the book, summing up what I'm trying to say. And he wrote an article called We're Living Through the Great Detachment, January 2nd, 2026. And so much of that article reflects what I have been thinking about over these last years for a number of reasons. One, as a grandfather, I have been doing childcare for my 3 youngest grandchildren, now aged 11, 15, and 17. Just as I did care for and had so much involvement with my older 2 grandchildren, now adults. One of the great pleasures of my life in my 56-year relationship with Jeannie, my wife. And I talk about it in my book, The Gospel of Zip, that I recorded for YouTube for free, all 8 hours, and you can watch it there, so I'm not trying to make a buck out of you, although if you buy the book and write a review, I'd be grateful. But David Brooks wrote this article about detachment that sums up the tragedy of, I guess, the metaphor for our whole period of high-tech, tech-bro, algorithmically boggled minds as young people turn to film the fire that's going to kill them instead of fleeing. And in The Great Detachment, Brooks is talking about the same thing I talk about in my book while retelling my love story with Jeannie in the context of talking about my love also for my dog Zip and the fact that he puts relationships and people first, unlike what David Brooks describes so brilliantly in his article that I sent to my podcast producer, Ernie Gregg, and I said, look, it's like David Brooks has just rewritten a synopsis of my book. So let me quote a little bit from his article, if I may, and read from it. Brooks writes, love is a motivational state. It could be love for a person, a place, a craft, an idea, or the divine, but something outside of the self has touched something deep inside the self and set off a nuclear reaction. Brooks goes on a little later. The deepest need of man, then, the psychologist Erich Fromm once wrote, is the need to overcome his separateness, to leave the prison of his aloneness. Picture a kissing couple, a carpenter wrapped while working his craft, an astrophysicist at full attention gazing at the cosmos, a nun in prayer. Those are people transcending the boundaries of self. They're not looking into a phone or trying to film what's around them to share on social media. They are participating because they love what they are doing. Brooks continues, to be loveless is to be on autopilot and disengaged from life. Love, on the other hand, fuels full engagement. Quote, a person's life can be meaningful, end quote. The philosopher Susan Wolf once wrote, quote, only if she cares fairly deeply about some things, only if she is gripped, excited, interested, engaged, or as I earlier put it, if she loves something, end quote. Continuing with Brooks, pay attention to those words, cares, gripped, excited, engaged, loves. Brooks says one great way to live is to go around with a posture so open-hearted that you find things to be wholehearted about. The other day, I read a wonderful opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal by someone who my producer, Ernie Gregg, has just contacted, asking him to be a guest on my show, talking about the longevity of his two parents. His dad, I think, died at 98. His mom's 99 and still going. And he was saying, it's not red light or diet pills or this or that or the other regimes of health. It's connection with people. And all the studies show the same thing. In fact, in my book, The Gospel of Zip, I quote the same studies that this columnist in the Wall Street Journal quoted. One big thing called the Harvard Longevity Study that followed people found the people with the longest lives and the happiest lives were the most connected to other people. As David Brooks says in his article, if you want to know about me, know the things I love, my kids, my wife, America, God, friends, New York City, the Mets, writing, the Chesapeake Bay, reading intellectual history, playing sports with great enthusiasm, and mediocre talents, Montana, teaching, my list goes on, and I'll bet you have your own. And I have a similar passage in my book, The Gospel of Zip, that I want to share with you when I talk about a few of the things I love in section 320 and 321. I've got it all in short sections for people who don't read much or for people who want to listen to me reading it. Breaks into short sections, makes it easy to get through. When Jeannie, that's my wife, recently visited her sisters in Napa, I found myself caring for Nora, 11, for 5 days, all day. She was out of school with a strep infection. If I'd missed that week, I would have been robbed of one of the best moments of my life. It happened in the doctor's office when Nora said, "Thank you for taking me to the doctor." And I'd answered, "There's no place I'd rather be right now than with you." And she'd answered, "There's no place I'd rather be than with you, Ba." They call me Ba, B-A. And she meant it. And Nora cooked me omelets, and we played cards, and I read to her, and we talked. And when I came home from a dermatologist visit after he'd taken 2 biopsies from my forehead, in the early evening after her mom came home from work, Nora walked to our house with a selection of chopped get-well blueberries and nectarines for you, Ba, that she'd made for me. So I never have to ask, why am I here? Who am I? Or what is the meaning of life? I know who I am and why I'm here. I am a grandfather. And then in section 321, right afterwards, I say this. What is the whole grandparent thing about? Maybe this: grandparents reassure grandchildren that the sky is not falling. I made the same mistakes and survived. The climate is a mess, but so was World War II, so was the Black Death. When half of Europe died, people still fell in love. People still had babies. You don't need to wait for perfection. Life usually goes on. Everything is mostly going to work out. Live. And that's just a little section from my book, The Gospel of Zip, that so mirrors what David Brooks is writing about. And I guess this mirrors the experience of what I regard as wise people. David Brooks writes in his article, Americans are having fewer kids. Americans are having fewer friends than before and spend less time with the friends they have. Church and synagogue attendance rates have been falling for decades. The share of Americans who said they feel patriotic about their country is down, especially among the young. In 2023, a Wall Street Journal NORC survey asked people about what values were, quote, very important to them. Since 1998, the share of Americans who said they highly valued patriotism, religion, having children, and community involvement have all plummeted. The only value Americans came to care more about, the survey found, was making money. And then Brooks uses the title of his article. He says, you might call this the Great Detachment, as if you're watching someone else's life and then holding your phone up to film the concert you're at for whatever purpose, to prove you were there, to prove you're a person to share on social media. The thing that killed a number of these young people the other night in Montana as they held up their phones to share the experience on social media, as if somehow that was more important than experiencing the actual experience, including feeling the fear that they should have been feeling and rushing for that narrow staircase and getting out. That too was a form of tragic, great detachment. Brooks goes on and talks about this, and he says, you can build a culture around loving commitments, or you can build a culture around individual autonomy, but you can't do both. By the way, that would have been a great quote on my book. I put on the front a canine human love story exploring why most dogs and a few humans live joyful lives, but I could have also put what Brooks wrote. You can build a culture around loving commitments, or you can build a culture around individual autonomy, but you can't do both. Over the past 6 decades or so, we chose autonomy, and as a result, we have been on a collective journey from autonomy to achievement anxiety. And Brooks talks about this in the article, and of course, in reading those news clips about the kids who were trying to take pictures and film the disaster that was going to kill them rather than reacting to it directly, that was a kind of a metaphor for everything the tech bros have done to us with their algorithms, trained on us to hook us to these mediums we use instead of experiencing reality. According to a Pew Research survey that Brooks quotes, 52% of conservatives said that the decline in marriages was a negative development for America. That view was shared by only 23% of liberals. And I may just say this is very, very stupid of liberals. To make marriage and connection and living life directly and loving and experiencing the things I experience with my grandchildren a politicized kind of pawn, as if somehow enjoying and loving family is about being a conservative, is really very silly. I've had some interesting careers, but I'm so glad that I never looked at my life through the lens of trying to make money rather than live. Brooks goes on and says, no, I'm not saying that everybody has to get married. Marriage is not for everybody. And I say the same thing. But Brooks continues, but on average, married people are happier than unmarried people. The University of Virginia sociologist Brad Wilcox, by the way, someone who endorsed my book heartily on Facebook, thank you, Brad, and who has been a guest of mine on my podcast that is produced by Ernie Gregg in conversation with Frank Schaefer. Sociologist Brad Wilcox and the San Diego State psychologist Jean Twenge, another guest of mine on my podcast, in conversation with Frank Schaefer, and colleagues wrote a report for the Institute of Family Studies, which found that married women ages 25 to 55 were more likely to say that life was enjoyable most of the time. Married women with children were only about half as likely as unmarried women to say they often felt lonely. Well, go figure. If I came home from that dermatologist to a lonely house, and I have a big income or something because I've stayed autonomous and done my thing, it would have been a very different world than having a grandchild who brings me a little salad of berries cut up to say, welcome home. And when I cut my hand here, I still have the scar. It looks like the Nike symbol on a on a tool I was using, a big belt sander with a very rough edge. And Nora, when she was 6, 7, learned how to rebandage when I was doing the wound care on there. It was a very different experience than if I'd had more money in the bank or one of those stupid platinum cards so I could get in some godforsaken lounge at an airport and feel fancy for 2 minutes than if I hadn't had her there. So, of course, that result of loneliness is a fact. According to the General Social Survey, 93% of liberal women who were married with children said they were happy. Only 63% of liberal women who were unmarried and childless said they were happy. As Wilcox wrote, my friend Brad Wilcox, who endorsed my book and was on my podcast, in an email to me, that's not to me, that's to Brooks, we're now seeing a stunning 30 percentage point difference in happiness between liberal women who are married with children and those who are single and childless. And yet, of course, the whole second wave feminism idea was that fulfillment was in career. And by the way, my wife had a brilliant career as a publisher, and my daughter is the CEO of a company in New York, and all my beautiful, wonderful women in my family work and do wonderful things. But thankfully, none of them have put a priority on making money and fulfillment of career above love and connection. And so we are a happy family. He continues, if on the other hand you resist the autonomy ethos and put loving passion at the center of your philosophy of life, you will find yourself tied down by all sorts of obligations to things like a spouse, kids, community, God, a vocation. But your love for these things will constitute fires in the heart, producing great vitality, full engagement, and increase in personal force. It is one of the weird paradoxes of life, and that's the message of my book, The Gospel of Zip, that the constraints you choose are the ones that set you free. And I experienced that today when Jeannie went off to her yoga class, and she fell the other day and broke her arm, and it's getting better, and she's exercising. She came home and I had made her lunch. And meanwhile, I lay on the floor listening to Tristan and Isolde, one of my favorite operas. And by the way, the overture is used in one of my favorite movies, Melancholia. And I was waiting for her. And then my dog Zip, pictured on the cover here, heard the door open before I did. His hearing's better than mine now. And he leapt up and ran to the door. And I called after him, Mama's here. And I could feel my whole interior self change because of the love of my life had walked through the door. We've been together 56 years. The food on the table would be meaningless without having made it for someone else. And the direct connection to life is life-giving. And the disengagement for life that has bought into the algorithmic nonsense given to us by our greedy tech bros who have dominated us says, hey, there's a fire starting. Let me get some pictures of it to share online. And that's a metaphor for the disconnection we have in our world today. And I'm so sorry for those young people and their parents and their friends and their grandparents. But the disconnected, loveless life that Brooks talks about is the great curse of our age, however we got there. And if you want joy, passionately connect and love above all else. And then maybe your job, or your fancy name for it, career, will have some meaning. Happy New Year. My name is Frank Schaefer.